welcome to The Olive Tree, the programme that brings you news and interviews from believers in Jesus living and working in Israel today, Jewish and Arab people. I'm Julia Fisher, and my guest today is Julia Pascoe. She's a missionary with Jews for Jesus, an international organisation of primarily, but not exclusively, Jewish people, who are all followers of Jesus and whose mission is to relentlessly pursue God's plan for the salvation of the Jewish people. Julia was born in London into a Jewish family. Whilst they were not particularly religious, they followed Jewish traditions. It was whilst working at a successful job in London that Julia met a Christian friend who started talking to her about the person of Jesus. So I asked, how did she react?
Well, I had heard the gospel sort of briefly as I grew up in different situations. I remember being handed a leaflet on the street when I was in my very early 20s, but I heard it clearly for the first time in 1995. I met a born-again Christian.
What was your reaction?
My first reaction was, I'm Jewish. This is irrelevant to me. I'm not interested.
You were quite firm about that. You did not want to pursue this subject.
That's right. Yeah. And I used the fact that I was Jewish to try and deter her.
But she wasn't deterred, I gather.
She wasn't. She was very committed to helping me understand the gospel, and she knew I was Jewish. So, she understood God's plan for the Jewish people.
But it's quite a big thing. I mean, you held out on the fact that I'm Jewish, I don't need this. Is that a common attitude amongst Jewish people when Christians start talking about Jesus?
Yes, it's one of the top answers or objections. Most Jewish people would say, well, I'm Jewish, so this is irrelevant to me. The truth is most Jewish people have never heard about Jesus or his teachings in the original Jewish context.
Mm. And also there's a lot of history that's occurred
Yes.
in living memory. But let's stick with your story, because your friend was not going to give up easily. You were resisting. So where did the breakthrough come? Who cracked first? Who blinked first?
We had a 3-year argument, and it got quite intense at times. And I remember I'd spend hours and hours with this woman. Her name was Tessa. Arguing with her, I'd be in tears and she'd be in tears. But at some point, and I think it was probably about 2 years into these discussions we were having, she gave me a book to read called Betrayed by Stan Telchin, a Jewish man who his daughter had come to faith in Jesus, and he set out to prove her wrong and to win her back to Judaism. And he knew that his daughter had been reading the New Testament, so he knew he had to read it if he had any chance to argue with her. And as he read the New Testament, he came face to face with Jesus, and he came to faith in Jesus, and his whole family came to faith. So as I read this book, Julia, my heart was pounding. Everything that Tessa had been telling me, and she'd shared some scriptures from the Old Testament, some messianic prophecies and all of these things, but everything started to, it became, I guess, like if you get a little sort of stone in your shoe and you take off your shoe and you shake it out and put your shoe back on, but the stone's still there. You can't get rid of it. It was something that I couldn't ignore. And I finished reading Stan's book, and I knew by the end of the book that this message of Jesus was true, that he is the Messiah and that he died for my sin and rose from the dead, and that I needed to know him, but I just didn't know what to do with that.
So what did you do?
I carried on arguing for a little bit longer because I think I'd exhausted all of my reasons for not believing in Jesus, and I realised that it was my pride that was in the way. And I had so much pride, I didn't want to admit to Tessa that she was right. But I guess it went on for a few more weeks, and she invited me to a Christian concert. And I said no. She knew I loved music, and she said, "Come on, you'll really enjoy it." I said, "Why would I enjoy it? I don't want to go." But she went on, and I just wanted to keep her quiet, so I went along with it. And I was just blown away. There was a band called Delirious, who I'd never heard of, but they were playing all these different songs about Jesus. And it came to a point where they sang a song called "Lord, You Have My Heart, and I Will Search for Yours." And after that song, they gave an invitation for anybody that wanted to repent of their sin and receive Jesus. And so I stood there in the place I was standing, and my friend was next to me, and I said that prayer out loud. And she turned to me and she said, "Well, if you really meant what you just prayed, then you just got yourself born again." And that was at the point that I first asked Jesus into my heart.
Now, did you know of any other Jewish believers at that time, or did you think you were the only Jewish person who had taken this step?
Yeah, I didn't know of anyone else that was Jewish that knew Jesus. And I think for many of us, we think we're the only Jewish person in the world that believes in Jesus. But shortly after, Tessa introduced me to another Jewish person who had come to faith in Jesus. And I eventually found a place of worship, my home church. That was a whole other story and very difficult journey trying to find a church I felt comfortable in. But at some point in my church, Jews for Jesus came to visit and did a presentation called Christ in the Passover. And that's where I really realized, wow, there are Jewish people who believe in Jesus.
That must have been very comforting for you.
It was.
Now, you were working in a secular job, you were doing very well. And I gather the point came where you were starting to volunteer for Jews for Jesus a little bit, and that interest grew, and gradually you were drawn further and further into the team in London.
Yes, I think it was about 4 years into my walk with Jesus. I'd done a little Bible course in a local college in East London. And part of that course was discovering spiritual giftings. And to my surprise, evangelism came up. And I didn't understand what this meant, and I didn't really want that. And after Jews for Jesus had visited my church, we stayed connected. And at some point, I got a phone call from Jews for Jesus asking if I would participate as a volunteer in a big outreach that they were having in London. It was called Behold Your God. And that was in 2003. And I said no to start with. But the person that I was in touch with didn't give up. And again, I had that same feeling. I couldn't ignore that invitation. And I felt that I was being disobedient if I said no. So I surrendered to that. And I served on that outreach for about a week. And it was during that week that the person leading the outreach invited me to consider coming on board with the team permanently.
I mean, how did you, I mean, that's a big step to take, isn't it? To sort of go public with your faith like that.
It was a really big step. Well, I mean, I'd already sort of gone public with my faith, but it was really about weighing up a cost because I had a good job, I had a good job, and I'd also got on to a really good counselling course. I was so excited about Christian counselling. And in my mind, that would have been the perfect life, really, for me. So this invitation to join Jews for Jesus, the team in London, just kind of, rocked all that around. And again, it was very uncomfortable. And I was quite clear it wasn't for me. But I always had that sort of, and I believe it was the Holy Spirit always nudging me, gently nudging me, that I wasn't to shut the door on this myself, that he would open that door or close that door, but it wasn't my job to do that. So I just went along with the process of application for working with Jews for Jesus.
But knowing that you'd be out of your comfort zone.
Yes, and I would be out of my comfort zone, and also it was a big step of faith in trusting the Lord for provision, because
Yes.
this wasn't going to provide the same kind of lifestyle as the job I already had. And
Mm.
also telling my family, because it was one thing telling them that I had come to faith in Jesus, but when I started talking about working with Jews for Jesus, um, that's when a bit of difficulty sprung up with some of my family members.
Well, before we talk about your entry into Jews for Jesus, let's just talk about your family, because as you say, this is where the rub really is, isn't it? When you go home and tell them that you have become a believer in Jesus, and in your case, not just that, you were going to become a missionary. I mean, how did your family cope with that?
When I initially told my sister that I had come to faith in Jesus, her initial reaction was "Oy vey," and then she sort of, she didn't react strongly, and she even came to my baptism, which I was very thankful for.
Mm,
But the rub really came when I told her that I was giving up my job in the city and working with Jews for Jesus,
mm,
and that's where the tension really started. And to this day, she still doesn't understand why. But I trust God that one day she will understand. My older brother was very upset with the whole thing for quite a while and
mm,
very vocal about it. But he eventually saw that I had something. He recognized that, and he even said to me, "I see that you've got something that most people don't have. You have a job that you love," and he could see the difference that my faith was making in my life. And sadly, he passed away about 3 years ago.
mm.
And I don't know if he ever said yes to Jesus, but I do know that he heard the gospel, and I know that he saw the difference that Jesus had made in my life.
You've been listening to Julia Pascoe, and we'll hear how Julia's story developed in next week's programme. The Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund is a Christian charity based in the UK that supports the needs of both Jewish believers and Arab or Palestinian Christians living in Israel and the wider Middle East. If you'd like to know more about our work and receive our free bi-monthly newsletter, please visit our website, olivetreefund.org. Meanwhile, join me at the same time next week for another story from the Olive Tree. Until then, goodbye.